I just want to thank everybody for coming. Becoming an IAM guru is my talk today. Note that it says guru, not expert, master, or whatever. It's just to kind of level you up, get you guys more comfortable. I apologize for the domain name. I bought that long before the current political climate. But never did I think it would be more appropriate. So I work for a company. They are both hiring and trying to sell you something. You all work for a company who are trying to hire and sell me something. So if you guys want to know more about my background, things like that, come find me during drinks. I love that this conference is not commercial, so I don't want to dive into that. I've been in the ops type field for about 5 years now, and 8 years prior of web development. So it's just a little bit of my background. My current job title, I like to say, is Senior Cloud Therapist. But I'm ops and site reliability. So just a little bit of an overview of what I think makes somebody above average in IAM. And it really doesn't take much. I think the first thing to have is a plan. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable at your company when it comes to IAM? How can you have a code review if you don't have a set of code review standards? Same thing for IAM. You know, what are you going to allow, what won't you allow? There's a lot of confusion for people about what kind of IAM policy I'm working on, so we'll talk about those real quick, kind of just entry-level stuff for folks who aren't super familiar. Finding and understanding the IAM documentation. I find that once you have a base level of comfort in writing a policy, actually finding what you need in AWS docs is really hard. I'm going to take care of you guys, make that super simple today. We're going to go over I've got a bunch of examples in slides that we'll talk about, and then I have only a couple slides on tools, and we'll get into why there's only a few of those. So there's kind of two areas you have to plan about. One is about what a policy actually contains, but we're going to start with process. Everybody hates process, me especially. I work for startups primarily. Process makes me moan and groan. But something as simple as how many approvals do you need in IAM change when it comes to your CI/CD pipeline, putting up pull requests, because we all put our stuff in infrastructure as code. Does this affect my compliance footprint? I've worked for a lot of companies that have like SOC 2 compliance, HIPAA, things like that. So you have to understand if I'm giving access away to an S3 bucket, do I need approval, not approval? Does it reflect clear understanding of the project? So a policy may be hard or difficult to read, things like that. So you might want to add some things in your process that say, you know, it has to have a statement ID or a comment or things like this, and a link back to a ticket. Kind of all the basics that everybody's familiar now with doing pull requests against a code base. And typically, you may need to have a bigger process doc around that. When it comes to a policy itself, I used to never understand what statement IDs were good for. I thought they were dumb. It's kind of annoying. It's basically a comment on that particular chunk of the policy. Can't use spaces in it. There's a lot of weird recognitionable character crap around that that I don't care for. But when you start getting with more and more people writing policies, statement ID is crucial to quickly understand what's going on. And I've heard at a couple talks today, which makes me happy, principle of least privilege mentioned. That's an important thing to talk about when we get into writing these policies. So like, for example, where I work, if you put up a pull request with a splat sign and an action, I will immediately reject your pull request. There's a couple reasons. One, it's not terribly secure. Two, I have a good feeling that you probably don't know what you're working with in AWS. I think typically, me included, when I start a new AWS project, if something's not working permission-wise, I'll throw a splat in, get it working, get going with the bulk of my project. But if you leave that splat in, it means you probably don't have a good grasp of all the processes or all the commands going on in the background. So I would expect somebody to circle back. And once they've used each of the pieces of a project enough to understand well enough to remove that splat. Additionally, one other thing I want to talk about splat and actions is, does anybody know how many describe actions there are in EC2? So if you do EC2 : describe star, how many actions that gives permission to? It's 95. So do they need all 95? They definitely don't. And one of the other things too, and it's a bit off into the tinfoily hat area, but a lot of security is what happens when AWS comes along and adds a new action. They add some new portion of EC2 that you may not want people to have exposure to, but you could have a bunch of splats in place. Same thing in resources. And this is where your plan comes in super critical when it comes to resources. And I have some examples of why coming on, but there are certain actions that can't be limited by resources, or certain resources that aren't named in advance. So you can't limit to a specific resource. If you think about giving somebody the ability to spin up and spin down Docker containers, you can't limit the ability to describe that Docker container by that resource because it doesn't exist yet. So your policy has to include exceptions. So you have to say, in the case of things that come up and down, my policy is X. And we'll get into some of that some more, which is the subtopic there of conditionals. So if I have resources that come up and down, and I give you permission for resources that come up and down, the policy can say you have to have tags, a name, an environment, whatever you guys use. And this policy gives you the ability to destroy or describe or whatever, but only these things with these tags. So what type of IAM policy am I working on? Pretty straightforward. There's a managed policy, a customer managed policy, and an inline policy. Managed policy, again, pull a request with that. I will immediately reject it. A managed policy comes from AWS. It's predefined. They are not very strict. And in fact, AWS has had several security disclosures around them. Like they've put up policies where people have used them, and then they find that they actually have the action in them to let you assume other roles. So there's like a really famous CVE for that one, where a gentleman found that he was using a managed role for one of the services. Then he had the ability to assume any IAM role in the account that he wanted. So you can use them. I typically would say I would use them as a starting point to understand if I'm using a new AWS service for the first time. But overall, they're generally not a good thing to go with. Again, they can change out from underneath you. They are pretty good about making new ones instead of editing live ones. But when it comes down to risk, and I work for a security company where one breach and the company's done, right? So those are things we have to worry about. So customer managed policy is just one that's owned and maintained by you. You attach it to a user group or a role. Inline policy, same thing, but instead of being attached, it's embedded within. So that's the big difference. So typically a policy, you'll either see it attached or embedded within. Attached makes it easier to add to lots of different resources. The inline is quick, one off, that kind of thing if you find yourself. There's a lot of other things, other permission boundaries. I've got some in the footnote. I'll make sure that the organizers get my updated slides. But like, for example, SCPs, anybody who's used AWS organizations, it lets you make multiple accounts under one AWS account. SCPs are a way to control what you can do in a given account. So there's lots of like sub types of IAM policies. You'll see this like on an S3 bucket policy or a KMS key policy, things like that. Let's see here. So of those three policy types, all of them manage one of two things. So those three types, you're either managing an identity or a resource. Identity is pretty clear. User, group of users, or role. Roles get attached to resources in AWS. Compute resources typically. But you also have resource-specific policies, things like an S3 bucket, Route 53 record, things of that nature. So this is the one URL, like completely ignore, sleep, whatever, take no value. And don't bookmark this, because I own this and it may change, but go to it, and it's going to take you, let me just pop this open real quick. This is like the golden page where everybody has trouble finding of the documentation. You can see it's every single service here. So let's see if we can find quick. We'll take a look at Amazon EC2. This is the landing page when you're writing policies. When you're looking for actions, conditions, resources, this is the page. So like this is going to be a huge page, so I'm going to scroll through this pretty quick. Like I said, of just described, there's 95 actions. But you can see off that table header, it lists the action, description of what it does, the access level, resource type, whether it's required or not, condition keys, and a dependent action or dependent actions if there are any. So just a couple things to note before I scroll down, because there's actually up to 3 tables on every page for the IAM stuff for a service. There can be 0 to many resource types. There can be 0 to many condition keys and 0 to many dependent actions. The condition keys can also exist on a resource type. For access levels, this isn't another slide, we'll come up to it, so if I don't remember it all, it's not a big deal, but there's list, read, write, and tagging, and there's one more which I can't quite remember. But basically, everything in these write columns are just links to the bottom two tables. And I might give up and pick a different service just because this is awful. This is EC2 is one of the worst when it comes to IAM. So here are the resources. So you can see here, like instead of guessing or trying to find an example online and copy and pasting, here you can find out exactly what a policy expects. So you can see here that if it has a resource type of capacity reservation, this is the format of the ARN. Additionally, you can see over in the right column which condition keys are valid. So I'm just gonna go ahead and click on request tag. It's gonna drop me down into this third table. Not all IAM actions have resources and conditions. So some of these pages you land on, they won't list them. But this is like, that link I gave you is, will bring you to the AWS directory of every service. Click in on any service you're using, you can see all these tables. Go back here. Yep, so I think we covered most of this. So actions are either of a group read or of a group write, but lists, you can see if it exists. So for example, you can see all the S3 buckets. Read, you can get the contents within a bucket. Write or create, modify, delete. Permissions management. These ones are labeled, they're not any different than a write grouping, but they're labeled specifically permissions management to call out that they're dangerous. So if you give this action to somebody, you're giving them enough to take over and rewrite all your Iam policies and lock you out. It's just meant to like draw additional attention to that. And then tagging, which is the same as having the right create, modify, delete. But if I give you create, it's essentially saying that in addition to create, modify, delete, you can also modify tags, because tags are like a separate resource in AWS. So it's just letting you know that in addition to modifying an S3 bucket, you can also modify the tags associated with that bucket. As I mentioned before, you can have 0 to many of resource types, conditions, independent actions. And there's some links in the bottom that go over this. So I'm just gonna dive into examples here. Let's see. So here we have a principal listed. And I don't know what it's doing here. All right. Not scrolling down for some reason. So in this case, here's an example of an Iam policy that's something to keep an eye out for. So principal is who has access. So in this particular case, this allows an outside account, AWS, to put objects into my bucket. So anytime you see a principal, keep your eyes open. It's explicitly giving permission to somebody else to have access. This is another common policy I think a lot of people see but get confused by. So what we see here is two policies that will exist in different parts of an IAM role. The one on the left just says, I want to give the AWS service the ability to assume a role. And the role that we'd want to let it assume would be on the right. If you put these in the same role, you don't need to put the resource of the role it can assume. If they were in different roles, I would add a resource line on the left side. So what essentially is happening is I'm giving RDS, which is Amazon in this case, the ability to go out, get a KMS key, and decrypt it so it can decrypt things in my database. So I want to talk about this one. So what we have here is there's AWS Systems Manager has the ability to connect to EC2 instances. If you run their agent, it becomes like a SSH shell, essentially. So does anybody have any ideas of how we might tighten up this policy? And so this is an example of using a condition. So I might want anybody on the team to be able to start a session, but because my instances are in autoscale groups, the ARN of an instance will change as things scale up, scale down, health checks fail, things like that. So in this case, if I have a group of on-call people, I want to give them access to any environment that's tagged staging. So there are global level conditions that are true of everything. So you can always limit IAM access based on an IP, a few things like that appear for every IAM action. Beyond that, we have to go back to that URL, look at what conditions are available for a given action. Go ahead.
So the condition will override the resource. The condition will work only on certain conditions, so it's not going to work for everything. So what should you do about the line that says resource start?
So the question, let me see if I've got this right, is the condition doesn't, you're asking if the condition works for everything and what effect the resource star has in this case?
Yes. So
yep.
It should be just one of them. It should not be together, right?
Yeah, so in this case, they specifically, this works okay, because what's happening is AWS comes in and goes, what action do you have? Start session. What resource do you have access to? Okay, I have access to all the resources. And then the next step of processing is, do you have any conditions? So it'll see this condition, and it'll peel every resource out of the access list, which doesn't have this tag called environment with a value of staging.
So it's like an if-then, but then is the first.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So this is another one. This is really interesting. There's a lot of really weird things in IAM that are hard to overcome. So this is an example of I don't know what a resource is before it comes up. So again, SSM, I've got an open session, open SSH connection, and I want you to have the ability to terminate it, but the session ID or the ARN of the session doesn't exist until after you launch. So I'll give you another example of how I might go about dealing with this here. So in this case, what we've got here is a resource with a star in it. So if I was doing a code review, the first thing I'd ask my developer is like, is this the only way we could do this? Is there a better way? And there's a, kind of an interesting thing going on in here. Everybody's used to seeing AWS : region, AWS : account ID. Those are actually CloudFormation things coming through. I should have replaced those, apologize about that. But far over to the right, there's an actual IAM has variables available to it. So when I approached this problem, the first thing I did was create sessions, and I noticed that the account of the user launching sessions appears in the resource name. So then I was able to use the variable AWS : username in combination with the star. And again, this is because I have no way in advance of knowing the ARN of sessions. I could have done tagging, except there's no way to tag a session that comes up. Like on an autoscale group, you can say, here's some tags and propagate them. There's nothing like that with SSM sessions. So in this case, my workaround was, hey guys, I have to use this star. I'm limiting my impact by using the username in the ARN of the current active user. This means that a user can only terminate sessions they've started and not other people's sessions that they've started. And additionally, if it's a risky area, like the policy that I have at my work is reach out to support. We have the middle level support, so we can chat. So it doesn't take long. Go out, fire chat, and go, this is what I read at this particular page, this IAM page. I see that there's no condition or resource, no way to limit this. Can you confirm? And then support will come back and say yes. And then when you put up the pull request, you can say, hey, this was my AWS support ticket number. So I did my due diligence. I looked at this really well. This is all we can do. Sometimes you're up a creek. Let's move forward and see what else we got in here. So this one I really want to get other people's opinions on. I see this a lot. So the first question is this a valid policy or an invalid policy? So just raise your hand quick if it's valid or invalid, what you guys think. Just got a few people who think it's valid. It is valid. This is one of those like service-specific knowledge things. It's valid, it works. Is it correct? And the answer there is like, nah. If you put this PR up, I'll reject it. I'll explain to you why I reject it. But This is one of those gotchas. You see this example on every website out there. Copy and paste this thing, and you can get access to your files on S3. What this actually says is, if you go back to the S3 page and you look at list bucket and you look at the resource it takes, and you go back to that page and look at get object and look at the resource it takes, list bucket actually works with the top resource, and get object only works with the bottom resource. So it will work. It is valid. Correct or, good form is a whole nother debate. These are things you just learn to watch for. And I think when it comes to helping other people on your team, it's a good way to catch this and educate them and go, hey, here's this doc, here's how you read it. So in the case, what I would do with this is I would split this up into 2 policies in the same role or group or anything of that nature. So I'd have 2 effect allows, one which had list bucket in the top resource, and one policy which had one stanza in the policy which had get object in the bottom resource. So who does this policy give access to my S3 buckets to? Yeah, anyone. Wide open. Principal star. So if you really got to keep your eye out. Principal is not commonly used in S3, but if you see it, this is how buckets end up public that aren't supposed to be public. So how about this one? Anyone with a 10.0, anyone in the 10 dot address space. So here's somebody who's come in and gone, well, maybe I should try and restrict this, but they really haven't done anything to restrict it. How about this one? What does this one do? So there are not conditions in IAM. There are not statements. So you can not action, not resource, and not condition. So this gives access to the world to anything but this bucket. So also something that you don't want to have happen. So it's saying, if you're anybody out there, you don't get access to list bucket and get object, but everything else, knock yourself out. Tools. So when we talked about the S3 bucket and whether or not that policy was valid, this is a real common view in AWS. It's really easy to browse past it. In here, I'm looking at a particular policy. You can see the ARN of it. But under the permissions tab there, everybody sees that yellow box. That yellow box is up right now because this policy is the same as the one I showed you. It's saying, hey, you've added an action, but you don't have the required resource. Like something's not matching up. And like everything Amazon, it's terrible wording. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But if this box is popping up, it's a common sign that you've got something not quite right going on in there. Tools, another one. I've been through SOC 2 compliance, HIPAA, FedRAMP, a whole bunch of googly goop letter soup. None of it's fun. This is a AWS CLI. This particular method, get account authorization details, dumps everything related to IAM. So typically somebody will join a chat room and clearly there's a staffing change going on, and they say, how can I tell what does Bob have access to? And this tool makes it easier to find what Bob has access to because it goes through and dumps everything. It's considered so sensitive to dump everything that to use this, you don't actually have to make a policy and give somebody the ability to list users, groups, and names. There is a specific IAM action for this particular API call. That's how sensitive they consider it. They don't want anybody to accidentally have access to it. I'm not sure why. They don't print out passwords or secrets or anything like that, but it will dump out your users, groups, and roles. Name, IAD, ARN, creation date on everything. If a user, if they have a path, any groups are associated with attached access control policies. Roles, it will list instance profiles and then trust policies as well. I use it for auditing. Everybody has different audit cycles and different things that they do, how often you're comfortable with doing it. This is one of those things where you'd better pipe it to a file because it's pages and pages of stuff. It's not a lot of fun to go through, but it is there. One of the things I ran out of time making slides for too and mentioned in the last talk was using CloudTrail. CloudTrail is a really excellent way, whether you're starting a project or you want to see who is using particular API actions. The way that I would typically start a new project is I have a developer AWS account for myself. I'll try something, I may get a permission denied error. If it's not clear, you can flip back to CloudTrail. It takes a little bit of using CloudTrail to get comfortable with it and the way it filters things. It's single-handedly the best way to see what actions you need. For the most part, an API call will match the IAM name. Pretty easy to find. There are some exceptions to the rule, and that's when CloudTrail comes into effect. One of the tools I saw a long time ago, and I didn't document it here, and something everybody asks about is, why can't I list out every single action that's available for a resource and then pick my favorite search logic to subtract and remove until I've figured out the bare necessities? And then I know I've got my policy, right? Like I can list out all 95 of the EC2 describes, run this tool, and it'll prompt me, did it work, yes or no? And I can hit no, and it'll switch out the actions for me automatically. And the reason I don't encourage something like that goes back to what I said in the beginning, where it's important to understand what you're building. And once you get a better grasp of what you're building, you can go back and tighten up your policy. So I'd caution highly about avoiding tools like that. And the other reason is, just because you've got now a list of actions that work, you should still be tightening up your resources, right? So you're not specifying a splat there for other danger to come up as well. So even if you had that tool, you get this false sense of comfort, and you still perhaps haven't locked things down. You still need to go through by hand. So it doesn't save you that much time. And then this is a really interesting space when it comes to IAM and permissions. There isn't really like a commercial vendor out there that sells a tool where you can go spend 100, 1,000, 10,000 a seat and have them go examine and look for weak policies and things like that. And a lot of that goes back to the complexity. And when you think of the staffing change, like what did Bob have access to? One of the tricks with IAM is keeping track of who can assume what role. Because it's very easy to see what groups Bob is in and what those policies give him access to. But the second he can assume a role, your complexity has just jumped up another level. So that's all I have. I sped through that pretty fast. If people have questions or they want to talk about stuff, I'm totally open. And you're welcome to email me, and I'll make sure the presenters get the latest slides so you guys can follow the links in the bottom to learn more. Cool. Yeah.
When your identities are on external ID pages, and they're, like you said, they're being they're federated and they're assuming a role, what's the best way to do that audit and see, who has access to all that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question is, when you're using single sign-on of some sort where the accounts aren't in AWS, and then auditing what they have access to, correct?
Yeah.
You would still use that same tool. So instead of getting back, your users list would come up empty. But when I've done SSO in the past, you typically say when this person identifies, they assume a role, right? So you get that role back, and you can see all the policies attached to that role and audit those policies. And if any of those policies then allow assuming other roles. So you've got to keep walking down that spider web, right? So it's a little bit easier in that on the AWS side, you're not auditing, do they have MFA turned on? When's the last time they changed their password? Things of that nature, right? So it's a little bit less you have to audit. It's like 1/3 less. Does that make sense?
Sort of the same command works though?
Yeah, yep, same command works. It's just like of those 3 categories, the one will be completely empty. So, cool. Anybody, anything else? Yeah. Start.
Can you describe what a cognito identity pool is, how it relates to IAM?
Yeah, so the question is, can I describe what a cognito identity pool is and how it relates to IAM? So it doesn't relate to IAM at all. So Cognito is a single sign-on service that AWS has that makes it easy to sign in with Facebook, Twitter, other services, and it maintains its own pool of users. It doesn't create any users in IAM.
Working with an Amplify, and you use the command often as
Yeah, I think there's some additional integration you have to do there. But I thought, and you can correct me, I thought out of the box that when you created a user, it just wound up in the pool. And then you had to pick there's like some feature you have to enable so they can actually get, what they end up getting is a set of IAM credentials.
The A in this context can't really treat it like that.
Yeah, incognito, you have to enable extra features, and then they have IAM access. But I don't know, and again, feel free to correct me, I don't think they get a dedicated IAM user. I think they're using exactly what we're talking about back in SSO. I think you assume the role. Yeah. Yep. Does that make sense? Okay. Did you have?
We're looking at this we call OPUS, ORAUS. They claim they can the identity mapping, and it shows you, which user cannot follow these privilege principles in the AWS based on the policy mapping. Have you heard of them?
I have not, and I'm typing it in my phone. So you said ORKUS?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, had I heard of a company called OARKUS, Orcus, which is supposed to do all of the IAM auditing, management, things like that. And that'd be interesting to see, because how do they decide that a resource is too broad or not too broad without understanding what you're launching and using it in? Gotcha. Okay. So it sounds like they're probably using CloudTrail to go through and look at when you last used an API call, which is great, except for your 1 yearly batch job where you go in and clean up snapshots or something. So
So, you should have a role for each lambda.
Yep.
Do you have any tips about the naming conventions? Because it gets suddenly like the names get very, very long.
So the question was, how do I manage naming of Lambda roles? And the number one thing about computers is naming is hard. And that's why I registered deport.me and regret it later on in life. And yeah, we argue at work about naming things all the time. Nobody wins.
So there's no.
No. I mean, it's something that's means something to your company, right? But there's no, anybody here have strict naming standards? No? Okay.
So how do you don't get lost with all these managing so many roles?
I mean, that's what infrastructure as code solves, right? So if I'm creating 1,000 Lambda functions, I'm not representing it 1,000 times in infrastructure as code. I'm boilerplating it and whatever my standard tagging scheme is. So in our case, we use name and environment. So it would be this, I would just have name dash environment dash lambda dash role. So it was pretty clear what it was being used for. I'm sure other people do other things, but I've never seen anybody get real upset about how they name things. So, go ahead.
How do you work around the limitations of IAM? Like, for instance, you can only assign 10 policies to a user, add it to 10 groups.
So the question is, how do I work around limitations of IAM? And I specifically didn't make a slide on this. There's a lot of interesting ones out there. In this case, it was specifically a user can only be in 10 groups and some examples like that. And that's where like splats or not splats and things get really interesting, because there's also limits on the size of a policy document, limits on the number of policies you can attach to a group and things like that. Thankfully, I've only run into document size issues, and I've busted them up into multiple policies. I've never been in a case where I've had to add a user to more than 10 groups. I have no idea what you would do there. Have you worked around that at all?
Now, I mean, we add more policies,
Ye-
switch out this. If they have the 10 policies set, then we add a group.
Gotcha. You make a new group, basically draw out a parent group and things like that. That sounds perfectly sensible to me. I mean, I don't know what else you would do.
It's not nice, but
Yeah. Cool. Anybody else? Anything? Good? All right. Thanks, guys.